Okay, Chapter 10. We've now started Section 3 of the textbook. Section 3 is all about patient assessment, documentation, and then some critical thinking and decision making. I have been known to say many times that the most important tool in your toolbox is your patient assessment. And this is very, very true. Because if you can't do a patient assessment, determine what's potentially going on with your patient, there is no way for you to actually begin the treatment process. So if you can't do a good assessment, you're going to end up with a lot of calls that you're like, I just have no idea what to do. So with scene Sizeup is the beginning of the patient assessment. And the patient assessment is really evaluating things from start to finish, and then putting those pieces together into a broad picture. There's obviously a couple of objectives for Chapter 10, and of course you'll find those on 244 and 45 in your textbook. Our scene Sizeup really begins at the point in which we get the call. So this is the part of the assessment that we actually do many times before we ever even lay hands on the patient. There is a multimedia video that talks about physical assessment and mechanism of injury. You can see that in the non-narrated PowerPoint, and that really mechanism of injury can be kind of a complex topic. So I would highly encourage you guys to go and look at that. Our core concepts that we'll touch on here: the identifying hazards at the scene, determining if the scene is safe to enter, mechanisms of injury and how they relate to our patient's condition, determining any additional assistance that we may need on the scene. So to start with scene Sizeup, obviously. Scene Sizeup is a survey of the scene. That's the way we used to say it, was scene survey. And it begins with the dispatch and the EMTs approaching the scene, and it continues throughout the patient assessment and care, and we make adjustments as we go. Most of the scene Sizeup is done initially, but it's forever a constant thought in our mind. So we're going to talk about learning, or talk about seeing some observations, making observations, how we can apply some of these observations to the situations that we may find ourselves in. Talk about natures of the call, and then obviously additional help. So some elements of the scene Sizeup. Number one, it's checking the scene to make sure it's safe. I'll step up on a soapbox for a second here. This is nearly every EMT student and paramedic student in the world. When we do practical skills and hands-on, is they'll walk into a station and they'll say, scene safe, BSI, meaning is the scene safe and I'm putting on my body substance isolation. I hate that. Usually they got their hands up in the air, they're waving their hands around like they got jazz hands or something. Scene safety is not just walking in somewhere and saying, oh, is the scene safe? We don't just walk into a patient's house and say, oh, is the scene safe? Oh, good, you told me it is. That's great. I trust you. Well, you need to put in your mind very quickly that patients don't always, and in many times don't, tell the truth. Scene safety is actually you stopping, looking around, seeing if there are any hazards. So it would be my preference in your practical skills, your hands-on scenarios that you're doing, that you say something along the lines of, I'm checking for any hazards, any wild animals, or is there any potential for a crime scene here, any people that appear to be unsafe, any chemical hazards, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it you're going to drive off of what your initial call was for. The second part here, they talk about taking standard precautions, which is sometimes called BSI or PPE. We've kind of talked about that in some previous chapters, but taking standard precautions. Remember, we call them standard precautions because we take them with everybody. And those precautions are to protect them from us and us from them. It's a two-way street. If let's say we respond to somebody who maybe has leukemia or has some sort of a condition that causes them to have suppression of their immune system. If we are all dirty, and when I say dirty, saying we've got maybe germs or we've recently treated a patient with an infectious disease, we've got that on us, and we go and we touch this immunocompromised patient, we very easily can hand them off whatever it is that our last patient just had. So taking those standard precautions, and those obviously we have to take different levels depending on what we're dealing with. Note the mechanism of injury or the nature of the patient's illness. And the mechanism of injury is how did they get hurt. So injury or trauma is how did someone get hurt, or nature of illness, nature of the patient's illness is how did they get sick or what is sick. So we don't always know how they got sick, but what's sick with this person. A respiratory problem, a heart problem, a general I don't feel good. We're going to determine those number of patients. In reality, we can handle at best 2 patients per ambulance. It's not optimal, but in reality, if we have a bench seat and we have a cot, we can really handle 2 patients. And that's if we have enough personnel. It makes it a very cramped quarters in there and can make things not optimal for patient care if we're having to split our time and our resources between 2 patients. But if we have more than 2 patients, we need help. In cases of mass casualty incidents, that changes a little bit. Let's say we went to a school bus crash. We may transport a few people sitting up on the bench seat just simply to get them to a place in which there's more hands to assist. But in reality, in most common emergencies we deal with, 2 patients is our max. And then decide what additional resources may be necessary. All right, when you went to EMT school, decided to go to EMT school, you decided you were going to take care of sick and injured people. And by doing that, you're providing medical care. That does not mean cutting people out of cars, rescuing them off their own roof, decontaminating them at the scene of a hazardous materials incident. That all requires additional personnel and resources. And those are the things that you then would need to determine off the bat, what exactly do I need for assistance? So if you want to learn how to decontaminate patients or extricate them or rescue them or whatever, that's fine. That's another class, and that's another job description for you. It's a different hat for you to wear. So when we decide what additional resources we may be necessary, it could be rescue services, might be the electrical company or the electric company, could be the gas company. We maybe need to call for fire, maybe need a special team on the fire department, hazmat team, high-angle rescue team, or maybe the patient has a life-threatening condition and we want to have advanced life support. Maybe they have the AEMTs or the paramedics show up and provide extra patient care. So that's deciding those additional resources. So scene safety, kind of I guess appropriate that we're looking at this background on this as I'm recording this the day after 9/11 of 2013. But this is a picture from 9/11, and the only thing that's predictable about emergencies is they're often unpredictable and they can pose many dangers. And that's very true. Even the things that we seem to think are going to be routine and mundane can quickly become out of hand and out of control very quickly. So we always have to keep in mind that the whole process of an EMS call is dynamic. There's always those potentials for changes. So some other things to think about. What are potential threats to emergency providers on the scene or on an EMS scene? And there's many of them. Many, many, many things that could potentially cause us to have, to put us in danger, to be a threat to us. So if we look at this picture in the background here, it shows us that we have some sort of a chemical in a tanker car, or actually it looks like probably a semi-trailer, a tanker, semi-tanker trailer, and it has a placard there. Now, we're going to talk eventually about how do we determine exactly what it is that we're dealing with here. That 1866 on a red background with a 3 at the bottom and a fire at the top, that tells us something. It tells us it's probably not something that we want to be messing around with, particularly around fire. But those numbers, we can identify those in a book or in a resource, and they can assist us in determining how to handle the situation. How close do we get? Do we need to evacuate people? Any medical precautions that we maybe are going to need to take with any people who are exposed? So that tells us a lot. But I started to talk about these earlier. People are the most dangerous thing that we deal with, because people will turn in a moment's notice and be extremely nice and cooperative, and turn around and the very next second they're ready to threaten you, assault you, batter you, etc. So people, other animals. We live in the heartland of America where agriculture is the king. I've been on many situations in which we had farm animals that were a potential scene hazard. Get called to a sale barn for somebody who was down in the ring trying to lead this cow around, and the cow decided they were going to have nothing of it and trampled people. Dogs, of course. Dogs are all over the place when we're coming to patients' houses. So even the itty-bitty tiny ones can be a big problem. So is there chemicals? Is there drugs? Are we going into a meth lab in somebody's house? Firearms, other weapons. I mean, all kinds of potential issues we're going to run into. So upon approaching the scene, look and listen for other emergency units approaching. Sometimes, as units are approaching, it's better to not let everybody know that you're approaching. So if we're going in on a potential crime scene, and maybe race is a particular problem in a certain area, and you're of one particular color, and you and your crew are, and the patients that we're going to deal with are maybe another. Could this potentially increase our visibility? Somebody's like, oh, look, there's a couple of so-and-sos walking into that house. Let's get them. So sometimes you turn the lights and the sirens off a couple blocks away. Also listen who's already gotten there. Has law enforcement already arrived on scene and determined everything is okay and it's safe? We're going to look for signs of collision-related power outages. So has there been an issue in which electricity is a problem? Observe traffic flow. So traffic is if you're out on the scene, say out on the highway for a crash, how is traffic continuing? Have they slowed down? Have they moved over? Or they just keep whizzing by? That's one of the most dangerous spots for us to be in, is in the roadway, taking care of patients from a vehicle incident. It happens probably at least on a weekly basis, if not more often. Somebody gets hit by a car. It's whizzing by. Somebody was rubbernecking trying to see what's going on. They were being a looky-loo, and now all of a sudden, wham, somebody gets hit and hurt. Look for smoke in the direction of the collision scene. So as we're watching as we arrive, is smoke blowing our direction? Is smoke blowing in a different direction? It's all those little bits and pieces that we start to look at that help us make decisions on where we post, or where we will put our truck until we're needed. How close do we get? How soon do we get in there? So when we're within the sight of the scene, we're going to look for clues to escape hazardous materials, whether we have vapors or things pooling or running. Look for collision victims on or near the road. And sometimes we really have to hunt. Sometimes we get people thrown from vehicles, and these people thrown from vehicles end up under the vehicle, they end up across the road, they end up in a ditch, they end up in a tree. odd situations. Look for smoke not seen at the distance, so maybe it's just now starting to kindle. Broken power poles, down wires, unstable scenes. Is the car unstable? Is it teetering on the edge? Is it on all fours? Is it on all four tires? Or is it over on its roof or on its side? All these things make big differences in the way we approach some of these. Be alert to persons walking along the side of the road towards the collision scene, and watch for the signals of police officers and other emergency services personnel. We have to be careful with other responding units. Number one, are we going to be in the way for a certain vehicle? So let's say we're going to a scene of an accident where there's been a collision, a car collision. Does our ambulance absolutely need to be the closest one? In most cases, it probably shouldn't be extremely close. Number one, if there's any potential for there to be a fire or explosion, we don't want to be all up in the middle of that. And two, do we have an extrication truck or a pumper coming in that's going to help stabilize this and have the tools on it to cut these people out of the car? We often don't need to be the closest truck in there. And if you have trucks approaching from different directions, it's dangerous to drive emergently. And if we have several vehicles from several agencies potentially responding, we have that higher risk of not everybody knowing exactly where everybody else is at and where they're going. So it's dangerous. So as you reach the scene, following the instructions you get from your incident commander. So an incident commander is the person that is generally deemed in charge, hence the title incident commander, of that specific incident. In most cases, it's the senior fire officer that arrives on scene initially, although there sometimes is something called unified command, in which there will be shared command from law enforcement, from fire, and from EMS, because they all have their specific duties that need to be performed. So talk to the incident commander. Now, if it's just you showing up, you're the senior person on the truck, you are the incident commander. You maybe aren't going to be real formal about it. You're not going to maybe start, spouting out a bunch of stuff over the radio that you're arriving on scene, no smoke upon arrival, establishing command, so on and so forth. But you are, or you will answer to somebody that is a senior medical authority to you. Don your appropriate protective equipment, your standard precautions. So as we're donning those, it's best to put those on as you're exiting the vehicle and approaching the patient. So you may have gotten them ready. To be honest with you, those gloves are hot, the masks are hot. You're sweating in them, and when you're sweating in them, you are already starting to break them down a bit. So it's best to have them in hand, and then as you're stepping out, you're putting them on. That helps. I think it puts a lot of more people's minds at ease as well, because they're looking and saying, oh, okay, they're doing this for me. They haven't just worn them all day, and now they're, somebody else's blood and guts are on their hands, now they're going to touch me. So establish any danger zones, any specific safe zones. Try to keep the ambulance out of the danger zones and determine what's safe, what is not safe. And this is all going to depend on the situation. Again, like I mentioned, do we have specific chemicals that we have to deal with? An extrication scene we have to deal with? Are we going to need a pumper in there to do something? So if you look on page 248 in your text, establishing a danger zone, it gives you some rough guidelines. So if there's no apparent hazards, try to stay around 50 feet. In this case, extends to at least 50 feet in all directions from the wreckage. So you're going to want to try to keep away from the immediate area of that wreckage, because there may be evidence. We may be just too dang close, and we're going to actually hinder the problems. when fuel has been spilled or there's some sort of a spill, be no closer than 100 feet. And in most cases, if we believe there's a hazardous materials incident, we should probably consider parking uphill and upwind. So when I say upwind, I mean the wind blows by you first before it blows past the scene. We don't want it to blow past the scene and then right into our faces. So it blows by you, then the scene. And uphill, most chemical vapors will settle. They will hang out in the valleys. So we want to be uphill and upwind. So that helps keep us as safe as possible. If we're talking about a vehicle on fire, at least 100 feet, probably several hundred feet, you're going to want to be away from it. And then wires down, you're going to have to pay attention to where those wires are. There is no right answer specifically to all of these danger zones. There's so many variables and so many what-ifs. It's really, truly hard to say. So you have to pay attention to everything that's going on. Evaluate for any threats of violence. So you walk in the house and somebody is on scene screaming and hollering, pounding. Maybe they have weapons in hand, maybe drug or alcohol use. Sometimes silence is a bad thing. Now, we'll tell you when you get to the pediatric section of this course, a silent kid is a sick kid. When kids are quiet in the presence of strangers and emotional situations, that's scary. Well, unusual silence can be scary as well. So you walk in the house, there's absolutely not a peep. That can be very unnerving. Knowledge of prior violence. This is an instance in which, have I been here before, and what were we here for the last time? You're gonna use that piece of knowledge to your advantage and say, okay, I remember the last time we were here. This is a potentially volatile scene. We are going to steer clear of certain spots, certain people, and we're going to make sure we have an exit. Although any call can present a potential safety hazard, what types of calls might pose the highest threats for potential violence? The number one dangerous scene for us is a domestic or other type of assault. So assault scenes are usually the most dangerous for us in reality. However, there is a lot of dangers when we're out on rescue scenes, so car crashes and whatnot. So those are very dangerous scenes as well. Those tend to be maybe a little more predictable as opposed to some sort of an assault, say a domestic assault, which becomes very unpredictable until everybody's accounted for and everybody has been quote-unquote secured. So the nature of our call. This is determining why we're there. So whether it's a mechanism of injury or a nature of illness, or sometimes it's actually both. Sometimes we have both. So with a mechanism of injury such as this, we're looking, this car crash, there's a big hole in the window. Unless that hole was put there by the rescuers, that's a problem. Windshields don't open up like that. So there's a good possibility that somebody maybe was ejected through that hole. Understanding these forces can predict injury patterns. So if it's a rollover incident, in which this appears to be, because you look at the scraping on every surface of the metal there, as well as the windshield and whatnot, this is anything can potentially be injured here. When we're talking rollover incidents, all injuries are fair game. Well, sometimes when we look at other types of incidents, a side impact or a frontal impact, that changes the potential injuries that we get. These forces are the ones that cause the injury. Remember, energy is not lost, it's only transferred. So when we take the energy from the car moving 55 miles an hour down the highway, and then it strikes something, and that something doesn't move, maybe it's a bridge abutment, something along those lines, that energy has to go somewhere. So some of it might move then through the structure that it was hit, but a lot of it then gets pushed back through the original source of energy. So in this case, maybe a car. Mechanism of injury on this one, we have a frontal impact here. You see that the girl in the passenger seat has her seatbelt on, but it appears that the driver does not. So what is that potentially going to cause for injuries? Well, seatbelted people may have slightly different injuries than unseatbelted folks. The airbags didn't deploy in this vehicle, so that may indicate to us that it wasn't as quite of a high speed or high energy impact, although as we look at the intrusion on the vehicle, and when I say intrusion, that's the part of the vehicle that's resting up against that pole there, it shows us that, and that's been pushed back maybe a foot or two. All kind of depends. So we don't have broken windshields, we don't have really terribly bloody, gory incidents going on, so that makes us a little bit more at ease about this situation than it would had we had much more damage to the vehicle. Head-on collision. Typically we'll get an up and over injury pattern. Occasionally you get a down and under, but up and over tends to be when they hit head-on, the front of the car kind of dips down and the occupants kind of project upwards towards the windshield. And in this case, it's pretty likely that somebody's head hit the windshield, so they had an up and over injury pattern. So you have to think about how, if you're sitting in the vehicle and I go up and over, how is that, what areas are going to be potentially affected? So if I had a seatbelt worn too high across my abdomen and I start to come forward, that seatbelt can cut into my abdomen. It can damage organs on the inside of my abdomen. If it was worn too low across my upper thighs and I came forward, did it cause injuries to my femurs or my upper legs? Did I have simply a lap belt on, or did I also have the shoulder harness? So the shoulder harness could potentially cause some injury there. If I didn't have anything on, then did my head strike the windshield? So that's an up and over injury pattern. So up and over the dash. And this mechanism of injury, that we can also have the down and under injury pattern. And in this case, this person would have tried to slide underneath their seatbelt and potentially hit their knees on the dash. So did we damage the knees, the hips? Was there some whiplash involved? Was there injuries to the lower parts of the body? That's typical with the down and under injury pattern. A rear end collision. Okay, so this is actually two different collisions you have to think about when you show up on an incident like this. You have a quote-unquote head-on collision and a rear end collision. So the driver of the truck will likely have the mechanisms from a frontal impact, and the driver of the van and any passengers in the van would likely have the injury pattern of the rear end collision. And that rear end collision typically results in neck injuries. There typically is a lot more whiplash when you have rear end collisions. The nice thing about most rear end collisions is they're more of a glancing blow in a lot of cases, and they tend to not be quite as life-threatening. Yes, they're going to have the neck injuries and possibly some spinal injuries, and you know, there's always a possibility that we take a look at either one of these vehicles packed with crap. Something gets launched, comes up from the back of the van, comes through the back window of the truck, and somebody else gets hurt. So rollover, anything possible. So if we have rollovers or rotational, say you got hit and your vehicle spun around in the roadway, we have multiple potential injury patterns because we have forces in several different directions being applied. It's not just forcing through in one direction. And in this rollover, you can have really anything injured. So to help determine our mechanism of injury, we want to try to find out where was that patient in the vehicle, and any safety components that were involved with that. Was there airbag deployment? Did they have the seat belt on? Was it just a lap belt, or was it a shoulder belt as well? Was there a child seat or a booster seat? And were they properly restrained? Was anybody ejected? And then if the vehicle is a motorcycle or an ATV, try to determine whether or not they had a helmet and if they were actually thrown off of that vehicle. When we're dealing with those, generally motorcycle ATV incidents, people don't tend to fare terribly well from those.